Han Solo's blaster has 3 small plastic cylinders on its barrel. They came from a model aircraft kit made in a Bournemouth factory where one designer, Phil Smith, produced 300 Balsa kits across 34 years. Won the Queen's Cup with a model he'd built himself and shipped tissue-covered aircraft across the Commonwealth. Then the company was sold to a distributor that never designed a single new kit. Unsold stock was dumped. The company number was renamed twice and died as a bankrupt retail chain in 2013. Today, semi-detached houses stand where the die cutters ran. No plaque marks the ground. This is the story of a man named Ronald who stitched his wife's name into the brand, a craftsman who taught a generation of boys to build, and how the banana-scented, tissue-covered world of British aeromodelling was extinguished kit by kit. Not through one failure, through 5 forces arriving together: plastic, screens, cheap imports, the death of the hobby shop, and a culture that lost its taste for making things with its hands. Chapter 1. The name inside the name. The story begins, as so many do, with a shop. Not a factory, not a vision. A shop. Selling model aircraft supplies from a side street in Bournemouth's eastern suburbs, a few hundred yards from Folkestone railway station, in the winter of 1932. The founder's full name has never been confirmed in any publicly available source. What is known, from Graham Ashby's researched account in Model Boats magazine, is that his first name was Ronald, and his wife was Vera. The brand name he chose was a portmanteau, Vera and Ronald, reversed. Veron. He stitched their marriage into the masthead and opened the door. The premises at Norwood Place were modest, a residential side street, terraced houses and a Salvation Army hall that had been there since 1907. The business first appeared in print that November, advertising as Model Aircraft Stores, Bournemouth, in the trade press, one line among many, unremarkable, easy to miss. Ronald wasn't building an empire. He was selling balsa wood, tissue paper, rubber motors, and cellulose dope to boys who wanted to make things fly. But this was 1932, and making things fly was not a fringe ambition. The Society of Model Aeronautical Engineers had been founded a decade earlier at a Camden Town tea room, the name suggested by F.J. Cam, whose brother Sidney would go on to design the Hawker Hurricane. A.V. Rowe, founder of Avro, was an enthusiastic model flyer. The first Wakefield Cup, the world's first model flying world championship, had been held at RAF Halton in 1928. By the time Ronald opened his shop, aeromodelling in Britain was already a movement with institutional backing, establishment patronage, and hundreds of thousands of participants. He wasn't entering a niche. He was entering the mainstream of British boyhood. Strong circumstantial evidence connects Ronald to the Forster family. A designer named W.J. Forster created Veron's earliest documented kit, the Eagle, a Wakefield rubber competition model, around 1936, with the kit released from 1937 onwards. By 1958, a Bill Forster was photographed in the pages of Model Maker magazine as managing director of Veron, reviewing a new boat kit with the company's chief designer. The most plausible reading is that Ronald Forster founded the business, that W.J., likely William J., was a relative who designed early kits, and that Bill Forster succeeded to the managing directorship. But no source definitively confirms the surname. The founder remains, in documentary terms, a silhouette, a man whose name is literally embedded in his brand, but whose face, voice, and full story have been lost to the incomplete record-keeping of small British manufacturing. What isn't lost is the date. On November 8, 1937, the business was formally incorporated as Model Aircraft, Bournemouth Limited. Company number 00333459. That registration number would survive through extraordinary corporate metamorphosis for 76 years. By the time it was finally dissolved, it belonged to a retail chain called Model Zone that had never manufactured a single kit. But in 1937, it belonged to a man named Ronald, on a side street in Bournemouth, who had 5 years of retail experience and a country that was about to go to war. The war years kept the company alive. The Truscall range, solid display models, not flying aircraft, sold to a nation that had never been more aware of what flew overhead. Details of wartime production at Norwood Place are sparse, but the products survived. Truscall kits remained in the Veron catalogue well into the 1960s, their descendants rebranded as Super Truscall. Ronald's little shop had become a manufacturer. What it hadn't yet become was remarkable. That required a different kind of person entirely. Chapter 2. The Man Who Walked Through the Door. In 1946, a young man with a degree in design and graphics walked into the Norwood Place factory. His name was Phil Smith. He was approximately 29 years old. He would stay for 34 years, and by the time he left, he would have designed roughly 300 model kits, drawn every plan, written every instruction leaflet, designed every piece of tooling, arranged every photograph, and painted virtually every piece of box art the company ever produced. Phil Smith was, in effect, the entire creative department of a manufacturing company. A one-man studio operating at a pace and consistency that borders on the inexplicable. Roughly 9 new designs per year, every year, for more than 3 decades. Aircraft, boats, gliders, control line racers, radio-controlled soarers, GTEx rocket models, quick-build kits, budget kits, competition kits. Each one prototyped by Smith, test-flown or test-sailed by Smith, tooled by Smith, documented by Smith. The plans were hand-drafted. The instruction leaflets were written in his distinctive, patient, precise style, detailing all stages of construction right through to covering and flying. The box art was his. The impact was immediate. By the 1947 British Industries Fair at Olympia, the great post-war shop window for British manufacturing, Veron was exhibiting as a full-range manufacturer. The stand showed the Kiwi tailless soaring glider, multiple kit series spanning beginner to expert, plus petrol and diesel engines, all marketed for export and home trade. The transformation from provincial retail shop to exhibiting manufacturer had taken barely a year of Smith's employment. Whatever Ronald Forster had built before the war, Phil Smith was building something larger, and he was building into a culture that was ready for exactly what he offered. The post-war years were the golden age of British aeromodelling. Not the hobby's golden age, but the nation's. By 1945, there were more than 500 clubs affiliated to the SMAE and an estimated 500,000 model flyers in Britain. Hundreds of disused wartime airfields had become flying fields. The annual SMAE Awards dinner was held at the Dorchester Hotel with Lord Brabazon, the Minister of Civil Aviation, and members of Parliament in attendance. In 1951, the SMAE Control Line Championships were held at Wembley Stadium, and the Shell Film Unit covered a control line display at the Festival of Britain on the South Bank. This was the world Phil Smith was designing for, not a niche of eccentric hobbyists. A mass movement with establishment patronage, public spectacle, and 500,000 participants who needed kits to build. Then came the moment that would define both Smith's reputation and Veron's identity for years to come. In 1948, the Northern Heights Model Flying Club held its annual gala at Hawker Aerodrome Langley, the very airfield where Hurricanes had been built and test-flown during the war. Queen Elizabeth, then Queen Consort, later the Queen Mother, attended with Princess Margaret. British Pathé cameras were rolling. A glider nearly hit the royal party. Control line models screamed past at 95 miles per hour. Phil Smith entered non-professionally as a member of the Bournemouth Model Aircraft Society. He flew a stretched and enlarged version of his Veron High Climber Wakefield design and won the inaugural Queen's Cup. The Queen presented the trophy. A photograph later published in SAM 35 Speaks shows Queen Elizabeth demonstrating to Phil the correct grip for launching his winning model. The caption, with magnificent British understatement, reads, "Phil Smith and friend." Smith described aeromodelling as a loving and endearing hobby in which I have chosen to make an honest buck out of it. It is the single most humanizing quote from anyone associated with Veron. Modest, warm, and entirely without pretension. The voice of a craftsman who loved what he did. Veron's management capitalized on the royal connection immediately. In the Model Planes Annual of 1949, they promoted Smith's newest designs, the Aerojet and Serojet, among the very first commercially kitted Jetex models in the world. Chapter 3. Rocket Fuel and Rubber Motors. The Jetex motor was the sensation of the post-war modelling world. Manufactured by Wilmot Mansour, it was a tiny solid fuel rocket, smaller than a man's thumb, that could power model aircraft in actual flight. The concept was audacious. Controlled combustion, in miniature, in a hand-built balsa airframe launched by a schoolboy. Phil Smith was among the first designers anywhere to produce kits for it. His solution was elegant and practical. He fitted the motor in a trough along the belly of the fuselage, using what he called designer's license to subtly drop the fuselage contour below the true scale outline. It was a compromise, the purists might notice, but it worked. Nearly every subsequent Jetex scale designer adopted the same approach. Smith wrote frankly in the Aero Modeler Annual of 1951 that it was virtually impossible to emulate the streamlined contours of a modern fighter with anything but formers, stringers, and laminated balsa construction. He wasn't hiding behind marketing language, he was explaining his craft to people who understood it. His Jetex scale range eventually included the Fouga Cyclone, Supermarine Attacker, F-86 Sabre, Republic F-84 Thunderjet, and Hawker Seahawk. Tiny rocket-powered replicas of the jets that were reshaping aviation, each one designed to be built by hand from a flat box of balsa and tissue. But rockets were the spectacle. The backbone of Veron's business was something quieter and more enduring. The rubber-powered flying model, the control line diesel kit, and, from 1952 onwards, the model boat. Smith launched the boat range with the Police Launch, a design simple enough for a competent builder to complete in a weekend. Over the following decades, the range expanded to encompass tugs, cabin cruisers, yachts, and even a 52-inch Vosper fast patrol boat. By the mid-1950s, Smith had adopted spindle moulders to shape large balsa blocks into prefabricated hull components. The Titan tug and later designs used this technique, and the boat kits became a significant secondary revenue stream. Bill Forster, photographed as managing director in 1958, was reviewing one of these boat kits with Smith when the camera caught them. Two men, side by side, at the heart of a small company that was quietly becoming one of the most prolific kit manufacturers in Britain. And across it all, Smith maintained a standard of documentation that set Veron apart from its competitors. Every kit came with a full-size plan, hand-drafted by Smith, peppered with his characteristic assembly sketches. Small, isometric drawings showing exactly how each joint, each former, each rib should be positioned. The instruction leaflets were patient, thorough, written for the 11-year-old building his first model alone in a bedroom. Where Keelcraft's instructions could be terse and assumed prior knowledge, Smith's walked the builder through every stage. It was teaching by stealth, a craftsman passing on his knowledge through the medium of a printed leaflet, to boys he would never meet, in towns he would never visit. The company was growing. Export was significant. The 1947 British Industries Fair had specifically mentioned export, and when the Combateer control line combat model launched in 1955, designed primarily for the Australian market, the entire first 3 months' production went overseas. Veron kits were reaching modellers across the Commonwealth and beyond. The little factory on a residential side street in Bournemouth was shipping boxes of balsa and tissue to the other side of the world. Chapter 4. What it smelled like inside the box. To understand what Veron sold, you have to understand what a boy experienced when he opened that box. Inside, sheets of die-cut balsa wood with parts printed directly onto them, a distinctive Veron technique. Strip wood in various dimensions, pre-shaped trailing edges, wire undercarriage, a rubber motor coiled tight, tissue paper translucent, delicate as butterfly wings, plastic wheels and a propeller. And at the bottom, folded carefully, the plan, Phil Smith's plan, full-size, hand-drafted, covered in his assembly sketches, and the instruction leaflet that would guide the builder through weeks of concentrated work. The building process was ritualistic. You pinned the plan to a flatboard, laid waxed paper over it so the glue wouldn't stick to the drawing, popped balsa ribs from the die-cut sheets. They came away with a satisfying crack, leaving a faint outline where the die had pressed. Glued them to longerons and spars with balsa cement, working outward from the plan, building a skeleton in 3 dimensions over a 2-dimensional drawing. Fuselage sides went up on the board in halves, then were joined over formers. Wings were built flat, then eased free and attached to the fuselage with careful alignment. Gradually, over days and then weeks, a skeleton emerged, impossibly light, structurally coherent, recognisably an aircraft. Then came the tissue. You cut it slightly oversized, dampened it with water, smoothed it over the frame, and trimmed it with a razor blade. The tissue clung to the balsa, translucent, showing the ribs beneath like the bones of a fish. And then the dope. Cellulose dope was a clear, shrinking agent, a solvent that tightened the tissue drum taut and gave it a lustrous sheen. It smelled of bananas. Not faintly, not subtly. It filled a room, permeated a house, caused family arguments, and remains the single most evocative sensory trigger of the entire hobby. One modeller recalled building his planes, covering them with tissue, and then doping it while sniffing in the vapours. Another admitted to the proverbial trip from inadequate ventilation, adding dryly that he didn't have to leave the farm. The smell permeated everything. It got into curtains, into carpets, into the builders' clothes. Mothers complained. Fathers, if they'd built models themselves, understood. The banana scent of cellulose dope is, for a generation of British men born between 1935 and 1970, what Proust's Madeleine was for Marcel, the involuntary key to an entire buried world. Veron's range at its peak, broadly the 1950s and 1960s, spanned every category of model aviation plus boats. The 1962 catalogue proclaimed them the most popular kits in the world, which was marketing language but not entirely fantasy. The True Flight series offered rubber-powered flying scale models, perhaps 26 designs covering everything from the Aeronca Champion and Cessna 172 to the Fairy Swordfish and Messerschmitt 109. G Quick Fix kits were pre-decorated sheet balsa models for quick assembly. The control line range included the B-Bug, the Combateer, and the Speedy twin boom. Gliders ranged from the simple coronet and wagtail to the radio-controlled slope soarers that became Smith's signature in later years. 2 designs stand above all others. The Veron Cardinal, first released in 1951, was a 35-inch span free-flight power model designed for small diesel engines of half a cubic centimetre to 1. It was engineered for extreme inherent stability. A beginner could build it, fit a tiny diesel, and fly it with a reasonable chance of getting the model back in one piece. Over its lifetime, including production under later ownership, the Cardinal sold more than 170,000 units. 170,000 flat boxes, each containing weeks of work, each carrying Phil Smith's plan and his patient instructions. Each promising the transcendental moment of watching something you'd built with your own hands take flight. The Veron Impala, introduced in 1967, was a 52-inch slope-soaring glider for 2-channel radio control, rudder and elevator only. It was, in the words of one account, a balanced design capable of stable flights in all conditions that probably introduced more people to the delights of slope soaring than any other model. It sold approximately 140,000 kits. A larger development, the Big Impala at 74 inches, followed in 1976. Between them, 2 designs, 310,000 boxes. one designer. Chapter 5. The Rite of Passage and the First Disastrous Flight. The experience of opening a Veron kit has proven remarkably durable in the memories of those who lived it. Decades later, grown men describe the moment with a reverence others reserve for first kisses. Nothing beats opening the box on a kit to be faced with a feast of Balsa goodness, wrote one builder who assembled his first Veron Cardinal, aged 11, in 1993, decades after the company's peak, using old stock that had outlived the factory itself. Inside, high-quality printwood and stripwood, hardware, rubber, beautifully drawn full-size plans, detailed instructions and plastic wheels, prop and thrust bearing. The balsa smelled of wood. The plan smelled of ink. And the first application of cement began a process that would consume every evening for weeks. The progression through Veron's range was itself a rite of passage. A boy might start with a combi kit, the ultra-cheap design Smith launched in 1960, specifically designed to be produced cheaply. All four variants, Cadillac, Consul, Corsair and Coupe, shared a common die-cut parts sheet. They came with Veron's distinctive Balsa propellers, which definitely helped them perform better than with the average plastic item of the time. These were Veron's answer to the plastic kit invasion. Compete on price, stay in Balsa, get the boy building. From there, he might graduate to a true flight rubber scale model. A Spitfire, perhaps, or a Swordfish. Its biplane rigging a test of patience and fine motor control. Then a control line model with a tiny diesel engine. The terrifying, beautiful moment of holding a screaming model on wires while it carved circles in the air. Then, if he was serious, a radio-controlled glider like the Impala, and the transition from builder to pilot. But the first flight was often a disaster, and the disasters created the stories. One builder's account of his Cardinal's maiden voyage has become iconic in the online community. It was a cold but calm winter's day, and the whole family followed me out. I will never forget that flight. The Cardinal soared magnificently out of my outstretched hand, tracking straight as a die with the winter sun glinting off its wings. Away it flew for all of 1 metre, stopped dead in the air and blew up. He'd forgotten to detach the glow plug wire from the starter battery. The battery had swung forward and punched through the tissue. Another, encountering a Cardinal plan online decades later, wrote, "You've just taken me back 58 years. Also built and still have my Veron Cardinal complete with EDB engine. Mine also never flew due to, I now think, the fuselage being twisted during construction. I also had no one to assist me." And another, "So many memories flooding back of the Cardinal that my granddad built me in the 90s. These were not isolated sentiments. They were the shared experience of a generation. Every Veron box contained not just balsa and tissue, but weeks of concentrated absorption, the satisfying acquisition of craft skills, and, if everything went right, the transcendental moment of flight. And if everything went wrong, which it usually did, the stories lasted longer than any successful flight ever could. Veron sold experiences. The kit was the medium. The real product was the memory. By the early 1960s, the company's market position was clear. Kiel Craft was generally regarded as the dominant brand, the major supplier of Balsa model aircraft kits in Britain. Kiel Craft's budget ease-built range was the entry point for most young modelers. Veron kits were positioned as the next logical step up, slightly more sophisticated, requiring more skill, offering more rewarding results. Frog occupied a different niche entirely, having pioneered plastic model kits in 1936 with the Penguin range, predating Airfix by over a decade, while also producing flying models and their own diesel engines under the Lines Brothers conglomerate. Mercury was a smaller competitor whose products were later distributed by Kiel Craft. In this ecosystem, Veron thrived. Not the biggest, not the cheapest, but perhaps the most consistently crafted, the most carefully documented, the most evidently the work of a single mind operating at the peak of its powers. Chapter 6. The Summit Before the cliff. The 1962 catalogue represents Veron at its zenith. Power duration models, true flight rubber scale, gliders, control line, quick fix, super truscale, model boats, the beginnings of radio control. The most popular kits in the world, the catalogue proclaimed, and if the claim was marketing, the range behind it was real. Phil Smith was in his creative prime. 9 new designs per year. 300 kit designs would accumulate across his career. An average that never slackened, a consistency that never wavered. The factory at Norwood Place was cutting, printing, packing and shipping. Export markets stretched across the Commonwealth. The Cardinal was selling by the tens of thousands. Boys across Britain were pinning Smith's plans to building boards, popping ribs from his die-cut sheets, and learning, without knowing they were learning. The spatial reasoning, the patience, the hand-eye coordination that would later shape careers in engineering, surgery, design, and aviation. One clinical anaplastologist, a specialist who builds prosthetic body parts, traces his entire medical career to the spatial skills learned from kit building as a boy. A surgeon has lamented that his new generation of students lack the inherent sense of spatial coordination that came naturally to the generation raised on Balsa models. The hobby was never trivial. It was the seedbed of British engineering capability, and companies like Veron were its nurseries. But standing at the summit, Phil Smith and the Forsters couldn't see the cliff they were about to walk off, because the forces that would destroy Veron were already in motion. Had been in motion, in fact, since 1953, when a company called Airfix sold a polystyrene Spitfire through Woolworths for 2 shillings. That kit required no balsa knife, no building board, no tissue, no dope, no weeks of patient construction, no skill. It required a tube of polystyrene cement, an afternoon, and a boy willing to trade the miracle of flight for the convenience of a finished object on a shelf. And there were, it turned out, a very great number of those boys. The warning signs were visible only in hindsight. Balsa and plastic served different markets. Flying models versus static display. And a boy who built an Airfix Spitfire for his shelf might still build a Veron Cardinal for the flying field. But they competed for the same finite resource, a boy's leisure time and pocket money. And plastic was winning that competition in a way that wouldn't become obvious for another decade. The combi kits of 1960, those 4 ultra-cheap designs sharing a common die-cut sheet, were Phil Smith's earliest acknowledgement of the threat. Designed to compete on price with plastic kits while staying in Balsa, they were a holding action, a rearguard. The first quiet concession that the world Veron had been built to serve was beginning to change. At the summit, the view was magnificent. Below, the ground was already shifting. Chapter 7. The 5 Forces. The decline of Veron was not caused by a single catastrophic decision. It was caused by the convergence of at least 5 external forces, any one of which would have been survivable alone, but which, in combination, proved fatal to every traditional balsa kit manufacturer in Britain. Not just Veron. All of them. The first force was plastic. Airfix had launched its polystyrene Spitfire through Woolworths in 1953 at 2 shillings. A price point that transformed model making from a specialist hobby requiring weeks of skill into something any child could enjoy in an afternoon. The kit came in a bag. You glued the parts together, you painted them if you were conscientious, left them grey if you weren't. The result sat on a shelf and looked, to a 10-year-old's uncritical eye, like the real thing. No building board, no tissue, no dope, no heartbreak, no first flight that ended in a field. Through the 1960s, plastic ranges expanded relentlessly. Airfix alone offered hundreds of subjects. By the 1970s, Japanese manufacturers, Tamiya, Hasegawa, Fujimi, set quality standards that no British manufacturer could approach. The moulding was sharper, the detail was finer, the instructions were clearer. The peak of plastic modelling was probably the 1970s, precisely the decade when Veron's balsa business was under maximum pressure. The distinction that had protected Balsa, plastic kits don't fly, Balsa kits do, held for a while. But it assumed that boys wanted to fly. Increasingly they didn't. Or rather, increasingly they wanted other things more. Which brings the second force, the screen. Television in the 1960s was the first competitor for children's attention that didn't require leaving the house. A Veron cardinal demanded weeks of concentrated effort before it could fly, or crash. An episode of Thunderbirds demanded nothing but sitting still. The BBC and ITV competed for the same scarce hours between school and bedtime that a Balsa kit required. And television won those hours effortlessly, without mess, without banana-scented fumes drifting through the house, without fathers stepping on half-finished wing panels left on the dining table. Home computers arrived in the early 1980s, the Sinclair Spectrum, the BBC Micro, the Commodore 64. Video game consoles followed. Each wave pulled children further from patience-based, craft-intensive hobbies. The progression was inexorable and entirely predictable in hindsight. From outdoor to indoor, from active to passive, from maker to consumer. A boy in 1955 built a model because there was nothing else to do that was as absorbing. A boy in 1982 had a Spectrum, 3 television channels, and a Walkman. The Balsa kit didn't stand a chance. The third force arrived later but proved equally devastating. The almost ready-to-fly revolution. From the 1990s onwards, ARTF models, manufactured primarily in China and Taiwan, offered a fundamentally different proposition to anyone who wanted to fly radio-controlled aircraft. An ARTF model arrived largely built and covered. The buyer installed radio gear and a motor. 20 minutes of assembly, not 20 evenings. The aircraft were made of expanded polystyrene foam, injection-moulded plastic, and pre-applied vinyl coverings. They were light, cheap, crash-resistant, and, crucially, they worked. They flew straight out of the box, more or less, without the agonizing trim adjustments and CG calculations that a scratch-built Balsa model demanded. The dedication and craft that had been inseparable from model flying were suddenly optional. You could fly without building. The skill of the hand was replaced by the skill of the thumb on a transmitter stick. Traditional Balsa kit sales took quite a hit. The ARTF revolution didn't just compete with Veron's products, it severed the link between building and flying that had been the entire basis of the hobby since the 1920s. The fourth force was the death of the shop. Independent model shops were once ubiquitous in British towns, the essential retail channel for Balsa kits, engines, dope, tissue, and the expertise that went with them. The man behind the counter knew which glue to use on which wood. He knew why your model turned left. He'd built 100 kits himself and could diagnose a twisted fuselage at a glance. He was the human interface between the manufacturer and the builder, and for many boys, he was the reason they persisted through the frustrating early stages instead of giving up. These shops began dying in the 1990s. Rising rents, crippling business rates, online competition from overseas retailers offering Asian-made products at prices no high street shop could match. A shrinking customer base as each generation produced fewer young modelers than the last. The loss created a vicious cycle. Fewer shops meant fewer places to discover kits, which meant fewer new entrants to the hobby, which meant fewer customers for the remaining shops. Even Hobbycraft, the UK's largest arts and crafts chain, founded in 1995, eventually operating over 100 stores, would begin closing branches. The infrastructure that connected Veron's boxes to the boys who built them was crumbling. And beneath all four of these forces, the fifth, the economy. Britain's broader industrial malaise of the late 1970s, the strikes, the inflation, the recession, the grinding stagflation that squeezed household budgets and small manufacturers alike, hit companies like Veron with particular brutality. A large conglomerate could absorb losses, restructure, diversify. A family-connected Balsa kit manufacturer on a residential side street in Bournemouth had no reserves, no diversified revenue streams, no parent company to subsidise the lean years. The company that had thrived in the optimistic post-war decades was exposed, without shelter, to an economic storm it had no capacity to weather. 5 forces. Plastic. Screens. ARTF. The death of the shop. The death of the economy. Each one pulling customers away. Each one shrinking the market. Each one making it harder to justify keeping the die cutters running, the plans printed, the tissue sheets folded into boxes that fewer and fewer boys would ever open. Any one of them, alone, might have been survivable. Together, they were an extinction event, not just for Veron, but for an entire category of British manufacturing. Chapter 8. What Veron did not do. The critical question for any story of industrial collapse is whether survival was possible. In Veron's case, the answer is almost certainly no. But the reasons why illuminate something important about the company and about the particular vulnerability of small, passionate, craft-based manufacturers when the world shifts beneath them. Veron did not attempt ARTF or foam models. No evidence has been found, in trade press, in hobbyist accounts, in any accessible archive, of any move toward pre-built or foam construction. The company remained, from first kit to last, a traditional balsa manufacturer. The closest it came to modernisation was the adoption of fiberglass hulls for late boat kits, the tarpon and pilot launch in the mid to late 1970s. A belated and limited concession to prefabricated construction applied to the boat range rather than the aircraft range, where the market pressure was fiercest. Veron did not diversify beyond its core. The expansion into model boats from 1952 onwards showed commercial agility. Phil Smith had correctly identified a parallel market that shared materials, skills, and retail channels with aircraft. But the company never moved into plastic kits, never developed educational products, never explored adjacent markets. Its entire business model depended on a single material, balsa wood, a single manufacturing process, die cutting and hand packing, and a single customer base that was contracting year by year. The company was critically dependent on one man. Phil Smith's output was prodigious. 300 designs, all plans, all box art, all instructions, all tooling design. But this concentration of creative capability in a single individual was a structural vulnerability of the most dangerous kind. There was no design team, no succession plan for the creative function, no second designer learning Smith's methods, absorbing his standards, preparing to carry the work forward. When Smith retired, the creative engine of the company would stop, and everyone at Norwood Place must have known it. Management succession is opaque. Bill Forster was managing director in 1958. Who led the company through the 1970s decline is unknown from available sources. Whether the decision to sell was made by a Forster family member, by Smith, or by other directors cannot be determined from the public record. The people who made the final decisions about Veron's fate remain as undocumented as the founder himself. Silhouettes behind a brand name, their reasoning lost. The honest assessment is this. Veron was a small, traditional, family-connected manufacturer that did what it did superbly well, but was structurally incapable of reinventing itself in the face of transformative market change. The creative genius was concentrated in one man. The product range was tied to one material. The manufacturing process was tied to one method. The customer base was tied to one demographic, boys and men who wanted to build. And that demographic was shrinking. Phil Smith could design a model aircraft that would fly beautifully. He could write instructions that would guide an 11-year-old through weeks of construction. He could draw a plan so clear and precise that builders 60 years later would still praise its quality. What he couldn't do, what no single designer in a small Bournemouth factory could do, was reverse the cultural tide that was pulling children away from patience, away from craft, away from the slow, difficult, magnificent act of making something with their hands. The forces were structural. The outcome was inevitable. And the tragedy is that inevitability doesn't make it hurt less. Chapter 9. the Sail, the Fade, and the Last Tug. In 1978, Model Aircraft Bournemouth Ltd sold the Veron brand and manufacturing operation to Amerang. Described in contemporary accounts as primarily balsa wood distributors. The cause was blunt: the difficult trading conditions that afflicted much of UK industry in the late 1970s. There was no drama in the sale, no acrimony in the public record. Just a small manufacturer acknowledging that it could no longer sustain itself, and a distributor acquiring a brand it presumably believed it could manage more efficiently. Phil Smith continued working under Amerang's ownership. He was in his early 60s, a man who had spent more than 3 decades in the same factory, designing the same category of product for a hobby he genuinely loved. He stayed until 1981, when he retired at approximately 64. 34 years. From the Queen's Cup in 1948 to the last designs of the late 1970s. One career, one factory, one purpose. The last new Veron kit released under Amerang was the Damen Stantug in 1982. A 29-inch Dutch tug with a fiberglass hull, priced at £49.50. It was virtually the final creative act of a company that had once produced dozens of new designs per year. After the Stantug, nothing. The pipeline that had delivered 9 new designs annually for 3 decades produced no more. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but something arguably worse. A slow, dispiriting fade. Graham Ashby, writing in Model Boats magazine, reported that all was not well within Veron under Amerang's stewardship. Hopes for a renaissance of the kit range faded amidst rumours of large stocks of unsold kits being dumped. The phrase being dumped carries its own weight. Kits that Phil Smith had designed, that workers had die-cut and packed, that were meant to be opened by boys on Christmas mornings, sold off as surplus, cleared out, disposed of. Some existing kits, notably the Cardinal, continued to be sold from remaining stock, eventually accumulating those total sales exceeding 170,000 units. But these were not new production runs. They were the last boxes from the last batches, trickling out through a shrinking network of model shops to a shrinking community of builders. Each sale brought the remaining stock closer to zero. Each box opened was one fewer box in existence. The factory at Norwood Place ceased operations, the die cutters stopped. The plan printer fell silent. The packing benches were cleared. No peak employment figures have ever been found. Norwood Place was a short residential street, and the premises were consistent with a small to medium operation rather than a major industrial site. But whatever the number, whether it was 15 workers or 50, every one of them walked out of that factory for the last time, and the building that had produced 300 kit designs over 4 decades became empty space. The legal entity lived on, in a form the founders would not have recognised. Model Aircraft Bournemouth Ltd was renamed Model Aerodrome Ltd on February 1st, 1988. Renamed again to Model Zone on March 1st, 1999. Under these later identities, the company pivoted entirely from manufacturing to retail, eventually operating 47 model and hobby shops across Britain, plus the Amerang wholesale operation. The transformation was complete. A company that had been incorporated in 1937 to manufacture model aircraft kits in Bournemouth had become a high street retail chain with no manufacturing capability whatsoever. In June 2013, Model Zone entered administration. Ripmax Limited, a rival distributor, purchased the Amerang wholesale business out of administration in July, safeguarding 18 jobs. W.H. Smith acquired the Model Zone brand name in October. Company number 00333459, born on November 8, 1937, as a model aircraft manufacturer, had died 76 years later as a bankrupt retail chain. Each renaming had moved further from the original identity. Each transformation had lost more of the thing that had once made the company matter. By the end, there was nothing left of Ronald and Vera's little shop, nothing left of Phil Smith's 34 years, nothing left of the 300 designs, or the 170,000 Cardinals, or the Queen's Cup, or the smell of dope drifting through a bedroom where a boy was building something with his hands. Just a company number. Dissolved. Chapter 10. The Parallel Extinctions. Veron's collapse was not an isolated event. It was part of a systematic extinction that destroyed every significant British balsa kit manufacturer. A rolling catastrophe that left no survivors. Keel Craft was founded by Eddie Keel, whose father Edward Sr. had worked on the de Havilland mosquito production line during the war. Eddie got the idea for balsa kits after visiting America. The business commenced around 1946 from Hackney Road, Shoreditch, with designs by Albert Hatfull and Bill Dean. By the 1950s, Keel Craft had moved to larger premises at Russell Gardens, Wickford, Essex, and was the dominant name in British balsa kits. The brand that most defined the hobby, the one whose ease-built range was the entry point for most young modellers. Then Eddie Keel was killed in a road accident when his Jaguar went under a lorry trailer on the A127. The company struggled without him and ceased trading. The brand was relaunched by Ripmax in 2018 as rubber-powered flying models, a ghostly echo of what it had once been. Frog, popularly said to stand for Flies Right Off the Ground, was the brand of International Model Aircraft Ltd, founded in 1931 by Charles Wilmot and Joe Mansour and absorbed into the Lines Brothers empire in 1932. Frog's innovations were extraordinary. They produced the world's first plastic model construction kits in 1936. The Penguin range in cellulose acetate, predating Airfix by over a decade. They manufactured their own diesel engines. During the war, IMA made Sten submachine guns, gliders, and scale models of the Normandy beaches for D-Day planning. But Lines Brothers, by then the world's largest toy maker, decided in 1962 to end all frog flying model and engine production. Lines Brothers entered receivership in 1971. The last Frog-branded plastic kits were produced in 1976. Many of the moulds were sold to the Soviet Union and marketed under the Novo brand. A Cold War coda for a company that had once made Sten guns for the Hot One. Airfix itself, the company that had done so much to shift children from balsa to plastic, went through multiple bankruptcies before being rescued by Hornby. Mercury faded. Veron faded. The entire ecosystem, the manufacturers, the shops, the magazines, the clubs, the flying fields, contracted, aged and retreated to a committed core of enthusiasts whose average age climbed year by year. The pattern was universal, family-founded, skilled workforce, dependent on a single material or process. Unable to compete with cheaper overseas production, a declining domestic market, rising costs, and the relentless gravitational pull of children towards screens and instant gratification. One by one, they closed, were bought, had their brands stripped, saw their tooling sold abroad or left to rust. An entire manufacturing culture, the hand-cut, tissue-covered, dope-smelling world that had defined British boyhood for a generation, was extinguished inside 2 decades. Chapter 11. The Greeblies on Han Solo's blaster. The most unexpected chapter in Veron's story involves neither model aircraft nor Bournemouth nor Balsa. It involves a galaxy far, far away. In 1976 and 1977, as Star Wars was being filmed at Elstree Studios in Hertfordshire, set decorator Roger Christian pioneered what George Lucas would call the Greebly approach to prop making. Working on a tight budget during Britain's economic downturn, Christian scavenged surplus shops, camera stores and, crucially, model shops for interesting-looking components to dress the props and sets of a science fiction film that nobody yet believed would change cinema. In California, model makers at Industrial Light and Magic, Paul Houston, David Grell and others, bought roomfuls of plastic model kits for kit-bashing the miniature spaceships that would become the most recognisable vehicles in film history. Veron's plastic radial engine cylinders, small ABS plastic parts, originally included in radio-controlled aircraft kits like the Hawker Tomtit for scale detail, proved irresistible to both groups. They were British-made, readily available in UK model shops in the mid-1970s. They looked convincingly mechanical, small, precise, industrial. According to prop replica specialists and the replica prop forum community, Veron cylinders appear on Han Solo's DL-44 blaster, 3 cylinders forming the distinctive front grille, as well as the Imperial C1, personal comlink, the Land Speeder, Greedo's blaster, Princess Leia's Tantive 4 blaster and her Endor pistol. Numerous other props and set details throughout the original trilogy carry Veron parts that no one at Norwood Place could have imagined would end up on cinema screens seen by billions. Today, Todd's Costumes sells replica Veron cylinders at $9.95 for a set of 3. Original vintage cylinders from actual Veron kits command premium prices among the prop replica community. 3-dimensional printed alternatives exist but are considered inferior by purists who insist on the authentic ABS originals. It is one of the great ironies of industrial history. A bankrupt Bournemouth Balsa kit maker achieved more global cultural penetration through a handful of anonymous plastic components on fictional weapons than through 40 years of legitimate manufacturing. The Veron name appears nowhere in the Star Wars credits, nowhere in any official prop documentation, nowhere in any source that a casual viewer would ever encounter. But the cylinders are there, on Han Solo's blaster, on Princess Leia's pistol, on the Land Speeder, seen by billions, recognised by almost no one. Phil Smith designed the Hawker Tomtit kit. He specified those plastic engine cylinders for scale detail. Tiny finishing touches meant to make a model biplane look more realistic on a shelf or in a display case. He could not have known that they would outlive every other product he ever created in terms of sheer global visibility. He could not have known that the most enduring legacy of his life's work would be Greeblies. Chapter 12. Norwood Place and what the silence keeps. The factory at Norwood Place is gone. Semi-detached houses stand where the die cutters ran. They sell for around £300,000 to £350,000. There is no plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement that this was once a place where craftsmen cut balsa, printed plans, and packed kits that taught a generation to build. Phil Smith retired to Verwood Crescent, Southbourne, a few miles from the factory, and maintained a plan service, selling copies of his 250 original designs by post. He was, by all accounts, active and engaged in the hobby community until the end. He died on May 22, 2010, aged 93. The Daily Telegraph published an obituary describing him as a highly influential figure in the world of aeromodelling. The full text remains behind the newspaper's paywall, a small but telling metaphor for a life's work that is increasingly inaccessible to the world that benefited from it. His son Colin continued the plan service after Phil's death. The copyright in Phil Smith's designs is held by C.S. Smith. The Veron brand lives on in 2 forms. The Vintage Model Company, based in Flag, Buxton, Derbyshire, produces 27 Veron Heritage replicas, laser-cut balsa kits faithfully reproducing Phil Smith's original designs. The laser cutting is more precise than anything the old die cutters at Norwood Place could have achieved. Prices range from roughly £42 to £112. The Cardinal is there, the Impala, the Deacon, the True Flight scale models. Designs that Phil Smith drew by hand in the 1950s and 1960s, cut by laser in the 2020s, built by men in their 60s and 70s who remember what the originals smelled like. Meanwhile, Smith's original plans are freely available on sites like AutoZone, which lists 97 Veron designs, and on Aerofred and ffscale.cago.uk. Vintage unbuilt Veron kits surface regularly on eBay. An original boxed Cardinal fetches around £65. A rare Avro 504H biplane kit recently drew 10 bids at over £52. The aftermarket in nostalgia is modest but persistent, sustained by collectors who understand what they're holding. Not just balsa and tissue, but the compressed residue of a vanished world. The broader heritage community remains active. SAM 35. The home of real aero modelling, promotes vintage, classic and old-timer model aircraft across the UK. SAM 1066 publishes a free monthly newsletter. The British Model Flying Association, the SMAE's successor, has nearly 30,000 members and over 750 affiliated clubs with access to more than 1,000 flying sites. On summer weekends, elderly men fly vintage models over English fields, keeping alive skills and pleasures that the market has declared economically obsolete. The hobby did not die. It contracted, it aged. It retreated to a committed core who remember what it was and refuse to let it disappear entirely. The Balsa model kit occupies a specific place in British cultural memory. It is the gateway drug of engineering. Countless professionals, engineers, designers, aerospace specialists, surgeons, cite childhood model building as formative. The spatial reasoning, the patience, the understanding of structure and material that came from building a Veron Cardinal or a Keelcraft Senator didn't just produce hobbyists. It produced the generation that built Concorde, that designed the Harrier, that engineered the Channel Tunnel. The skills were transferable. The lessons were permanent. And they came in flat boxes that cost pocket money, sold from shops that no longer exist, manufactured by companies that are gone. The universal contrast is stark. Then, Queen Elizabeth presents a gold cup to a Bournemouth model maker at an airfield where hurricanes were built, while British Pathé films for cinema newsreels, and 500,000 people across the country belong to model flying clubs. Now, semi-detached houses on a quiet Bournemouth street, an eBay listing for £65, and a generation of men who remember the smell of dope but whose grandchildren have never held a Balsa knife. And somewhere in a galaxy far, far away, on a blaster carried by a smuggler, on a pistol carried by a princess, on a speeder that floats above the dunes of Tatooine, 3 small plastic cylinders from a Veron Tomtit kit sit in plain sight, seen by billions, recognised by almost no one. The most compelling detail about this story is not any of the 300 kits Phil Smith designed, not the 170,000 Cardinals, not the 140,000 Impalas, not the Queen's Cup or the 34 years of quiet, brilliant craftsmanship at Norwood Place. It is the accidental immortality of a company that otherwise vanished without trace from the street where it was born.